we did not have an opportunity to comment on Donald Trump's would be, I guess, July 4th military celebration, as it were. I will cop to not watching any of it, really. I guess I saw some clips. I saw that it was raining. I obviously saw that he conflated some events, time sequences, basically jumbling up things, that were probably about 150 years apart, but that happens to the best of us. What did you make of that whole fiasco? It didn't turn out to be the sort of the firebrand speech that people thought he would give. The whole thing was a bit of a dud.
Well, that's how I saw it, and I unfortunately did watch the whole thing because I had to write about it for my Salon column the next day. So that was my July 4th, was having to, first of all, watch the lead up to it, which everybody was wondering, was anybody going to show up, and what are the people at the thing talking about, and what have you. So I was watching that stuff all day. It kind of ruined my holiday, but. Yeah, it was a dud. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, one of the things I think, and I keep pointing this out and nobody ever listens to me, it's a myth that Trump went to France on Bastille Day and saw the big parade and was inspired at that point and said, I want to have one of those myself. He had wanted to have one of those for ages, and in fact had tried to do it for his inaugural. It was reported at the time that he had asked for a military parade for the inaugural, wanted the tanks and the soldiers marching and all that stuff, and they told him it couldn't be done, but he'd always had that in his head, and I suspect he's liked those military parades since he was a kid, right? I mean, he went to military school. He loves that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that was the inspiration for it, but of course, when he saw what the French could do, he was determined that he was going to try to outdo them with a much better parade showing how much better the U.S. military is, which was the whole point, to kind of show off the military as if nobody in the world understands that the United States has an incredible, the most powerful military on earth. He somehow feels we need to prove that. And so, he planned this thing, and of course it was a dud because it was nothing. I mean, he got a couple of sad-looking tanks sitting there. It was just ridiculous and kind of pathetic that, that was supposed to prove something. And then he had some, these flyovers from the four branches of government, which were fine. But, I mean, I've seen that at baseball games. This isn't anything special. So if the point was to prove that the U.S. government, that the U.S. military is the strongest, most formidable in the world, boy, it did the opposite. It showed that the U.S. is, if that was the point, the U.S. is kind of lame when it comes to putting on a military parade, which is fine with me because I don't think we should be doing that. It's completely antithetical to the way the U.S. Has traditionally viewed the July 4th and the idea of marching the military all over the place because we don't, the point of doing that in dictatorships and other authoritarian regimes is that you're not only telling the rest of the world that you have a strong military, you're telling your own people.
Right.
Which is kind of instilling fear, saying, hey, look, this is your government here. So, be sure and keep that in mind when you try and dissent. So, the U.S. has never traditionally done that. So Trump tries to do it. And, of course, it's raining. He can't read the speech. The speech sounded like it was written for somebody else. And it's pretty clear it's the first time he'd ever laid eyes on it because he didn't know any of the things that were in it. So it was a mess.
We should say that at one point he stumbled, the teleprompter stumbled or something stumbled, and maybe he was ad-libbing and he was talking about how the revolutionary forces took over the airports. I hope we don't have to explain to our audience.
Very well, Sam. He can't read very well. So this happens all the time. It's just that in that case, because he doesn't know anything about American history and is completely clueless, when he misread it, as he does all the time, he probably said, instead of port, he said airport, and then he skipped over some part and talked it Fort McHenry and the rocket's red glare, which was really the War of 1812, not the Revolutionary War. Or maybe they might have written that in there. I don't even know. I mean, maybe the people who wrote the speech don't know American history. But the idea of Trump sitting there talking about American history in lofty terms and doing all this, it's just not him. It was the phoniest speech he's ever read. It's clearly is not what he thinks about America. Any kind of discussion of any of it, even the military successes of the United States, his view of successful military action is, Blackjack Pershing, the apocryphal story of Blackjack Pershing dipping bullets in pig's blood, to scare the Muslims. I mean, that's the military that he likes, the one that tortures, the one that steals resources. I mean, this idea of, wrapped around freedom and, freeing other people around the world, I mean, that has nothing to do with him. And it sounded like it had nothing to do with him. Well, I mean, it was clear.
My thought was that in the run up to the speech, there was, and I will cop to not paying much attention to even the build up to the speech, because the only thing I heard about was, the tanks and the idea that the Park Service was going to have to spend millions of dollars to service these tanks being brought in at a time where the Park Service is already being starved of funds. But my sense is that there was a lot of concern that, along with the militarism, that he was going to be far more political about the speech. They did just hand out VIP tickets only to members of the RNC as opposed to the DNC, which is, pretty ridiculous for July 4th celebration. But I can't help but wonder if they almost at the last minute switched speeches, because he did seem unfamiliar with that speech. The speech did seem sort of very atypical. It did seem to be written to sort of surprise people as being almost as banal and mundane as it was. I can't help but think that there is a heightened sensitivity or some type of notion of like, oh, we're in an election year. We've got to be a little bit careful with some of this stuff in terms of the media. But I don't know. I mean, I think they are a little bit concerned about stepping out of, I don't know what lane it was. Maybe they just think there was going to be more people paying attention there that weren't necessarily partisan. But the whole thing turned out.
I think it was the military. I think that their reluctance over this whole thing and being used, because there had been discussions of putting, all four Joint Chiefs and stuff up behind him and all that. And they did bring up a couple, but they didn't. It wasn't just a bunch of uniforms surrounding him. I think that may have been what tempered them.